And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them. Yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
As always, thanks for tuning into the podcast. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the director of TeachThought Professional Development, and I wanted to share a couple logistics and housekeeping notes with you regarding some upcoming events that we have not previously mentioned on the podcast. A couple of them we have, and if you want more information, you can go to wegrowteachers.com/events, or just click along the top menu of wegrowteachers.com. There's an events tab. It'll pull down 4 additional events that we have published now. So those are January 15th here in Louisville, our home base. We will be hosting at a really great space downtown Louisville, a Creating a Culture of Inquiry workshop, and that's open registration. And that is limited to 20 participants. And March 16th through 18th, we will have PBL Hilton Head, our 2.5-day version of the Foundations of PBL workshop that will be right on the beach at the Beach House Resort in Hilton Head. So hopefully that's a good place for you to recharge and relax a little bit, but also do some interesting and productive intellectual and academic thinking. March 25th, we'll be back in Louisville at the Leadership Louisville space for a Leadership PBL workshop, which is, again, limited to 20 participants, where you will create a sustainable implementation plan for your school, and that one is meant for school leaders, not so much for teachers. And then, of course, June 22nd through 24th, we will have our 4th annual PBL Grow event. This one is, of course, Grow 20. So if you're interested in those, again, please navigate on to our website, wegrowteachers.com, and you'll see along the top menu events, and all of those should be accessible from there. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, Drew, at teachthought.com. And as always, we appreciate any shares or mentions or anything like that with our content, including our podcasts. It helps us and hopefully helps you. In this podcast episode, I spoke with Robert Kaplinsky, who is a math educator advocating for teaching of math differently than what we might see traditionally, or what most educators have seen in their classrooms as students and teachers. So we touched on the differences of being good at math and how speed of computation is not necessarily the best way to define that. We also touched on some social justice issues, the recent legislation in Seattle public schools, and how math is being used there. A little bit of a touchy subject and interesting for sure. His open middle concept, which is the problems that have perhaps a closed beginning and closed end, but an open middle, and how that might help with problem-solving skills versus just computation skills. We also touched on problem-based learning versus project-based learning and other pieces of the puzzle of math education. So certainly a topic worth diving into and paying more attention to, as probably all educators and most adults feel some sort of detachment or frustration with math learning and teaching. So hopefully you find this podcast helpful. Robert, welcome to the podcast. Happy to have you on. We're going to talk about some math-related things and your work in that space, but as I often like to do, I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and give our listeners a better idea of who they're hearing.
Thanks, Drew. So I'm Robert again. I've been a math educator since 2003, more recently as a teacher specialist for Downey Unified School District. I have started a website called openmiddle.com, co-founded that, and I'm a recent author of a book called Open Middle Math, Problems That Unlock Student Thinking. I also founded the Observe Me movement, which is an education where people are sharing signs about welcoming people into their classroom and telling them what they want feedback on. And in general, I'm just really passionate about professional development and helping teachers become the teachers that they want to become.
Okay. And you started as a math teacher, you said in 2003. Tell us a little bit about that teaching career, if you would.
Yeah, I really had no business being a teacher when I first started. I was a programmer out of college, and then the whole dot-com collapse happened. And I was really I really didn't understand. I love teaching. I love working with kids, but I really had no idea how much work it took to become a teacher. It seemed like if I could just teach one kid, how hard could it be to teach 30 kids?
Right.
Really having no idea about that. I started with an emergency credential. I had not ever spent a minute in a classroom since college. I had not taken any student teaching. I had not taken any education classes. I was really pretty awful. But I mean, really even for the first 3 years or so. But once I started kind of really realizing what math education could be, and that it didn't have to just be what I had, which was sort of being a math robot and making more math robots who could do math but didn't really know what they were doing. I think I really started to develop a passion for both what it could be and how to get there.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure, as you're painfully aware, as most educators and most people think about math, it's a really difficult teaching and learning piece of the teaching and learning puzzle, because it often feels so disconnected, and there are certain people who certainly, at least in my estimation, have a real strong aptitude for computational thinking and those kinds of aptitudes that make it more interesting, more engaging, easier perhaps. And then there are others who don't have that cognitive strength necessarily, and so it can be confusing, it can be frustrating, and almost, I would imagine, almost everybody has had the experience of sitting in a classroom. I'm remembering, 500 years ago when I was in a classroom as a student, and the algebra or geometry or whatever math teacher, they're going over things and talking through things, and I'm just looking and thinking, what in the world are they talking about? This makes no sense, and it's so frustrating, and that's intimidating, that's frustrating, and so I think we've got to think, just like I think about teaching social studies and history differently, I think that we've got to think about teaching math differently as well. So tell us a little bit more about this open middle idea.
Yeah, I'd love to. If I could just say one more thing about what you were saying. Mm-hmm. One thing I think is worth reflecting on is, what does it mean to be good at math, right? I think that growing up, when we're in like elementary school, we think it's, maybe you can complete your times tables in like less than a minute. But then when you think about real life, like, no one freaking does that. Like that never happens.
Right.
That speed of calculation doesn't matter.
Right.
I've learned a lot from people like Marion Dingle, who really just asked that question, because I think that what we have centered in terms of what does it mean to be good at math is along the lines of really being a robot that doesn't necessarily understand what it is. And then when you start to think that maybe you're not good at math because you're not good at the things that people have determined actually matter, then you are just hopeless. But the reality is that people express their mathematical abilities in so many different ways. And I think that really we have a messaging crisis in terms of both what we have internalized and what we teach our students, that this is what it means to be good at math.
Right. And so I want to linger on that for a moment before we get to the open middle, because that resonates with me. My oldest daughter especially, and I do think she is quote unquote good at math. She's a thinker in ways that she has an aptitude towards math. Now, I say that with the other pieces of the puzzle that I hear her talk about as a student, and there are other students who are, let's say, in that's the way you defined it, better at math, right? There's one student in particular, his dad is a former math teacher, so you can imagine he has some strengths that he brings to the table, either nature or nurture or both. And he is really good at reciting quickly. And I do think there's also some value in being able to have that fluency and doing it quickly, or maybe the opposite is true, not being slow at it, right, where it's a real struggle. I mean, we're not saying we don't want kids to memorize their times tables and be able to recall that quickly, but the speed at which they can do math is not necessarily the full picture. And so she says, I'm not as good at math as he is, because it's clear that he can do it much more quickly and is more fluent in it. So it does filter down, and I think you're right, that message that we send about what you're good at or what you're not good at and how we define that is often problematic.
Yeah, I mean, just think about this. What if we increased teacher wait time so that, and pick a number, maybe it's 5 seconds after you ask the question, maybe it's 10 seconds, maybe it's 30 seconds a minute, so that everyone had time to kind of think about it. Well, right now, if you just made that change, it would stop being about who could calculate quickly, because after a minute, everyone's basically, had time to think about it. Now, or obviously that amount of time would scale depending on the type of problem. But what if instead of who could calculate the quickly, it had to do with whose explanation was the best or who had the most creative strategy, right? I just think that we have to reconcile this reality that no one really likes talking about, that the vast majority of mathematics we learn in K-12, no one ever uses again after they graduate, right? And so we spend so much time teaching these skills that we've always taught because that's what we've always taught, and not so much the skills that people actually need, which is like what to put into the calculator rather than how to do the calculation. So I think that there's a lot of uncomfortable conversations that need to happen that really just, I don't know, they really send these messages to some people that you're, like, traditionally women and people of color, that you're not good at math. And I think that that's a really big problem. I think we need to take a step back and think about what does it mean to actually be good at math.
So I've got a podcast coming up with a female STEM educator, and I think that that's an interesting wrinkle in this as well, in who we traditionally, stereotypically think is good or not good at math. And I think you're right. There are some cultural messaging bias pieces around those things that you mentioned, and that too is problematic. But that's an interesting piece of, and I've seen some debate on this, and not being a math educator, I wonder about it as well, is what is the utility of the actual math that we're learning and teaching in schools? And, when we get to, I think, it seems to me reasonable to question the utility of the actual skill, not the learning process, because there's two things there. The ability to learn and the process of learning higher level math, there is some value in that, even if you're not using the actual math in your world as an adult. But that argument, you could say there are other things that, it doesn't matter if you're lifting weight of steel or water or sand, it's that process is still there, right? But it seems to me like once you get past algebra, that what you said becomes more abundantly a problem, right? That how many people actually use calculus and upper level math like that, and what does that do to the way we think about math, and does it keep some kids from matriculating to higher ed because they got poor grades?
Yeah, you bring up so many good points. So let's see if I can unpack the ones I can remember. So the first thought is, I think that people have a hard time in general, and myself included, disentangling the nostalgia of the things that we're familiar with what is actually best. I think that what we teach in math, we've been teaching for so long that we just don't remember not teaching it this way. For example, there's a recent Freakonomics podcast episode where Professor Joe Boulder out of Stanford is talking with Stephen Levitt, and they're talking about where do most of the high school math standards come from? And they really came out of a response that we were falling behind during the Cold War in terms of we didn't have enough engineers and stuff. So you have these standards that are now, dominating, I would say, kind of algebra, geometry, algebra 2, pre-calculus, calculus, that were really important for a certain time. But yet, I challenge you, like, ask anyone like, it's got to be less than 1% of students or of adults who have used in their life calculus or pre-calculus or algebra 2, but yet no one really questions it. And then you bring up this point, well, we need that for to get into college, but at the same time, how many kids could be amazing in college, but these classes, instead of enabling them, act more as a gatekeeper? I had a blog post once recently where I asked, should we be teaching the same standards in math in 100 years? And it was really interesting how many people got really upset with this. And like, of course, it's math is math and it has to be the same thing. But then if you start to unpack maybe a standard at a time, let's start with coins. I think in 100 years, we're not going to be using like metal coins as we know it now. We might still have, decimals, but will we need to teach people like how to count coins? Will we need to teach kids how to tell time on an analog clock, right? You might say, oh, well, if there's a power outage, but the reality is this. Again, we spend so much time teaching things kids will never use again, while simultaneously there are a ton of problem-solving skills that we don't get to. So I guess a lot of the stuff we teach is because at one point we needed this, right? You maybe didn't have a calculator, but now everyone has a phone in their pocket, and these kinds of skills are not as important as others, in my opinion. So I think that it's really hard to have these conversations because people have very strong opinions about what should be. But I personally think that there's a big problem when we spend so much time teaching students skills that they never use again.
Yeah, so there's an opportunity cost that you are referring to when we're spending so much time doing that we're losing the opportunity to do other work, which you mentioned problem solving. And so the argument and the pushback, as I understand it, is that, we're not using those skills most people aren't using those skills. And I don't think there's any argument against that that's not true, right? But that it is really important that students be exposed to that kind of thinking, because that kind of thinking transfers to other areas, and that often students don't know what they're going to use or not use, and that kind of thinking, even though they may not use it, it actually might turn them on to other things or open doors for them intellectually and academically that they may not have been aware of. So I guess that's sort of the Steelman version of the opposite, or the pushback there, right?
My responses to this are twofold. First, calculus is a college-level class that somehow has snuck its way into high school. If you ask college professors what their take is, the vast majority, the data has shown that kids come in, like when they ask college professors how well or very well prepared are the students that come into your freshman level classes, they say they're very underprepared and that they lack the basic algebraic skills. And calculus could easily be taught in college. Here's a question. When did calculus, or why is calculus supposed to be superior to, say, statistics, right? There's AP statistics in high school. There's AP calculus. But I can damn well tell you that I've never used calculus in my entire life, but there are countless times that I wish I had better statistics skills. And I think that, even a simple change of saying, hey, if you don't have time to take AP calculus and AP stats, prioritize AP stats, I think would do wonders, right? If someone if they're going to need calculus, they can take it in college. It's a 1 semester class, a 1 quarter class in some cases. So I think that just so much is entangled with the things that we've always done in these preconceptions. But yet, I don't know anyone except for like a very small sliver of people that use any of these very high upper level math classes, but those people could also learn them in college too.
Yeah, so if you would, make the case for the importance of statistics, because I have made that case and others have made it eloquently, much more eloquently than I, but it seems like that is a really smart step in the way that we might reprioritize math education. But if you could, how do you view that, and what's the case for doing that?
So I don't know that I can make the most articulate case, but I'll share my thoughts. We live in a world of data, right? There is more data out there now and being produced on a daily basis than there has ever been. It's just overwhelming. And the issue now is how do you process it, right? Like, I don't think, before a few years ago, I'd ever heard the term fake news, right? But people have found, I mean, really, there's, from Benjamin Disraeli, there are three kinds of lies, damn lies, and statistics. Like, you can take data and make it say whatever you want, but people are woefully underprepared to understand what the significance of data is. And you interact with data in all facets of your life, from do I need health insurance to how likely is it to rain to whatever. And I think that people are underprepared for knowing how to interpret data, how to use data to make their own arguments more successful. And so I just think that that is something that is used everywhere, where, again, I challenge you, ask anyone you know if they've used calculus outside of teaching calculus, and it's going to be it's got to be less than 1%. So at the same time, statistics has to be something that people deal with all the time.
Yeah, it certainly is. And so this is where I think there is some bleed over, or should be more fuzziness between math and science and social studies, because I think we're doing a disservice in teaching these things in an isolated way, right? And one of the things that seems to be really important is to contextualize whatever it is that we're learning, right? So why is this important? Why is this statistic important? Why is this historical fact important? Or those kinds of things, right? So I see such value in the idea of using math in ways that are not in a vacuum, right? Just doing practice and working on them without connection to real life scenarios, right? So, and I think that is a potential strength of one of the things that I've seen, Seattle public schools using some of the social justice pieces to try with math, which at first blush, I think, how in the world is social justice and math connected? And I do have some real concerns about how that might be co-opted to get students to think, teaching them not how to think, but what to think. But I love the idea of connecting math and using that in a context, right? So the statistics around housing practices or airline safety or whatever the case may be, real problems.
Yeah, so I mean, a few thoughts on there. I mean, in terms of the Seattle public school curriculum, so I don't know that much about it. I know that they're writing a curriculum that incorporates social justice. I know that it's been well received by people that I respect and have seen it. I know that I've requested that maybe they can present at one of the national math conferences like NCTM. I will say that one thing that I really took for granted and really didn't understand or even think much about in the last year, or rather prior to the last year, was that math is not as neutral as maybe it would seem at first. Like, I'll give you some simple examples. Like, maybe people have heard of the Pythagorean theorem. And what's interesting is Pythagoras is not the first person to think of that. But yet we call it that because whoever decided to call it the Pythagorean theorem, that is what took over. And just as an example, there's this phrase, right? History is written by the victors. There's a lot of great discoveries in math education that are not just necessarily by white people, but as a white male myself, I find that kind of I'm just not thinking to question what I hear. In terms of kind of using social justice as a context, I think that there's a lot of really interesting contexts that you can use math to apply to. You had mentioned this idea of just kind of having a real world context. Dan Meyer uses this phrase that I love, which is, if math is the aspirin, then what is the headache? And I think that really we usually just say, I'm teaching you math, I'm teaching you math, I'm teaching you math for this abstract time in the future where maybe you'll need it. And I think that when you can provide the context, like, for example, something we often hear about is there's a pay gap between different groups of people, like between men and women, between white people and people of color. Is that true? How do you know? Like, people say that, but like, how do you even begin to determine that? And so part of that is statistics, and part of it is, data science. And so I think having this idea of just being able to be curious and then being able to use mathematics to answer those questions, I think is really important. Because if you go right now and Google, like, is there a gender pay gap? You're going to find people who say, yes, there is, and this is why. You're going to find people who say, no, there isn't, and this is why. And if you don't have any sort of strong foundation in statistics, it's really easy to be swayed. And so knowing more about math and knowing how to interpret data will really help you be a more informed citizen.
Yeah, so I guess there's an important distinction, or at least in my mind, and I don't want to linger on this social justice piece too long because we don't know enough about it, and it may not be a problem at all. But it seems like, so the example you gave of the Pythagorean theorem, while that's a problem that has math as part of it, the actual math, the theorem and the math is not the problem. It's how people named it, which is, again, it has to do with math and the use of statistics, or I don't know. I guess I think I've heard people say, or something on Twitter, of math being used as a tool of white supremacy or something like that, which seems to me to be odd in that. I mean, math is agnostic to any sort of, I don't know, it's agnostic towards any sort of bias or anything. It's how people are using it. So it seems to me to be an important distinction between math as a language, if you will, and how people think. And that's more of a social science issue. And again, that's where I think there might be real value in blurring some of those lines and contextualizing and not teaching it in a vacuum. I am a proponent, and always have been on the podcast, about questions and asking the right questions. And to your point, like some of those statistics, there's two sides, and it depends on which you might Google and your traffic from the past and what Google might throw at you, unfortunately, because I think that algorithm is working to confirmation bias, but that we really do need to continue to ask really important questions and ask hard questions, and then the math becomes a way that we can decode it and understand it better. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I definitely know where you're coming from, because I've been there too. When I first heard that, like, math could empower some groups and disadvantage others, I was like, that's crazy. What I've come to realize, though, was that I come from a place where my experiences are the ones I center. Like, I see it through the lenses of my own experiences. But what I found is by listening to other leaders in math education, like Hema Kodai and Marian Dingle, and even like the Clear the Air movement, which is the hashtag Clear the Air, and Val Brown, I've really found that there are more perspectives than I had realized. I'll kind of just end with this point of what math classes we value, really, and really what math we seem to think as, like, there could be ways that people express their understanding and their intelligence with mathematics that aren't the way that our current system fits. And so we might see that they don't know anything about math, when it's really that we're not asking the kinds of questions that would show that. And I would just put that out there, that the more I have learned and the more I have thought, oh, maybe I don't understand why this is, when I've been curious and tried to ask for more, I've had a broader perspective as to really where those gaps in the justice lays.
Yeah, well, no doubt, and I would agree with you as well. So that's one of the things we do differentiation workshops, and really believe in that idea of giving learners, recognizing the ways in which people learn and express their understanding and think differently, and all of the pieces of that puzzle. And yeah, I recognize, and I think those problems are important. It seems to me more of a social science issue than a math like the actual math itself, but I'm not sure how important that distinction is really. So tell me, let's come back to the open middle. Tell me a little bit more about the open middle concept.
Yeah, so maybe this is a good bridge to thinking about kind of how math could be different. So a lot of times, so I want you to think about a problem, or actually let's talk about Super Mario Brothers on a tangent here. If you think about Super Mario Brothers from when you were a child, every level had a beginning, a middle, and an end. So every level began with kind of Mario in the middle of the screen. Every level ended with Mario jumping on a flag. And if that was the entire sum of every level, that'd be boring as heck, right? Like no one would want to play it. So the beginning is closed, the end is closed. What's open is the middle. There are so many things, an infinite number of things that can happen in the middle, that's why you play, because you're just curious about what's going to happen and how it's going to go. I have kind of, having heard this metaphor first from Dan Meyer, I started exploring like what would math look like when it has an open middle. A lot of times we talk about how we love open-ended problems, and I'm not saying open-ended problems are bad, but what I think is really interesting is open middle problems. So you might have problems where everyone starts with the same problem, they all end with the same answer, and so the beginning and the ending are closed. But when the middle is open, where students got the same answer but using a variety of strategies, it leads to really interesting conversations where kids could talk about how they reasoned, and you can have comparisons about how the different strategies are connected. So I can give you an example of what one of those problems looks like, but that's the basic idea of open middle and really the problems that we have on that website.
Yeah, so give one of those examples, because again, that's resonating with me as I hear my 12-year-old come home and say, I don't understand why the teacher says, explains it this way when I can figure it out that way, and I don't know why it just is frustrating to her. So is that that's the middle?
Yeah, so think about that. That's what it feels like when you have a closed middle. When a teacher says, and believe me, I taught that way, so I know how crummy that would have felt. But when the teacher says, you must solve it using this method, now the beginning, the middle, and the end are closed. And it's like, why am I, for example, this is not the problem I want to give you, but this is just an example of what it could feel like if the middle is closed. Listeners, try solving this problem right now. 99 plus 46. Now stop. If you were trying to solve it using the method that your teachers taught you when you were in elementary school, you tried to put this 99 and then below it a 4 and a 6. And then you did the 6 plus the 9, and then I said stop, and you're like, what the hell? But if you solved it a different way and said, well, 99 is kind of basically 100. So if you take 1 from the 46 and make 100, well, 100 plus 45, that's easy. That's 145. And there are many ways to solve this problem, but there's one beginning answer, or one beginning question, so it's closed. There's one beginning or one ending, so it's a closed answer. But there's many ways to solve it in the middle. And the conversation about those different ways are interesting. Using 99 plus 46 is great when you're using a calculator, but when you're doing it in your head, it's hard to keep track of all those numbers. So you might do things like use the associative property, where you're borrowing a 1 from the 46 to make 100, because 100 is much easier to keep track of in your head.
Right.
So that's the basic idea of this open middle. But if you want me to give you an open middle problem that you can kind of see the beauty of this and why kids love the challenge, I can give you one right now. Does that work for you?
Yeah, but let me ask one follow-up question here on that. So I did the same thing that you said, right? So I immediately I stacked 99 and 46, and then I realized, well, that's going to be too hard for my brain to keep track of. And then I realized, 99 is close to 100, and kind of did a similar process to you that you mentioned, right? And so that visually was easier. I could say, 145, boom. But the clarify for me, I guess, in the teaching, in the classroom, obviously being able to stack these two things on one another and do the math on a piece of paper is also important, right? So we want to make sure that we're giving both and maybe other options for figuring that out, or not ignoring that skill, right?
Yeah, so it's not my intention to say we should never teach a standard algorithm. So those methods that you know that you're familiar with that you use, they call them often standard algorithms. I'm not saying we should not teach that. What I am saying is that sometimes we only teach them. And so, for example, if you did that 99 plus 1 because you took 1 from 46, I don't know if anyone ever taught that to you when you were in school. Like, you must have taught that to yourself, because I don't remember. I mean, most people say that they were never taught that. So I think that the reality is that some of the ways that we know how to do math work really, really well in specific situations. Like that standard algorithm of lining up all the digits works really well with paper or with a calculator. It's really hard to do in your head. And if you don't have a calculator and if you don't have paper, you have really no good backup plans. So I think that we should just be, I don't know, cautious and maybe even curious about how kids think, and then find ways to integrate the various strategies, because those lead to deeper conversations than just be a robot and follow this procedure endlessly and do endless practice.
Right. Okay. So yeah, let's get to a more sophisticated example.
Okay, so what I love about open middle problems as we define them on openmiddle.com, that's OPENMIDDLE.com, is that they tend to have, not always, but they tend to have, so they always have a closed beginning, and they tend to have a closed ending where there's just one answer, but the middle is open. There are many ways to solve it. And they often have really low floors in the sense that anyone can begin. And they often have really high ceilings in the sense that it gets really challenging to find this best answer. So let me describe this problem to you. And it may be hard to visualize, but I'll try my best. So imagine a fraction where it's got 2 boxes in the numerator on top and 2 boxes on the denominator on the bottom. So it's like a blank and a blank over a blank and a blank. Now you can use the digits 1 to 9, one time each at the most, to put a digit in each of these 4 boxes. So you're only going to use 4 digits. And the goal is to make a fraction that's as close to 1 as possible. All right, so like maybe you just begin guessing, which is what I would do, and you put like a 1 and a 2 in the numerator and a 3 and a 4 in the denominator. So you've got 12 over 34. All right, so is that the closest fraction you can make to 1? Then you might try some other digits. And what you start to realize is no matter what numbers you pick for your first 4 digits, you're in the game. You got something. But then you start thinking, dang, should I just keep guessing? Or if I don't want to keep guessing, like, how do I strategically pick my digits so I get a fraction that's closer to 1 and not just farther? And so this is an example of kind of what we're after. Kids will start working on this. I mean, that one problem can take me or other adults, 10, 15, 20 minutes. Sometimes it takes kids the whole period. So you have these great conversations about what does it mean to be close to 1, and how do you know if your fraction's close to 1, and how do you know if one fraction's closer than another fraction, and what strategy should I use to pick the digits? And it leads to just really, really interesting conversations.
Yeah, so there's a couple things there that I think are interesting threads here. One, which is the conversations, and that's definitely a departure from what I experienced as a math student, which again was 500 years ago. But the other piece is the time and the departure from, or at least as I'm perceiving it, the apparent departure from practice, lots of practice, right? So how do those things square up or fit in the equation?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting to consider how we define practice. For example, imagine so this problem would be a good standard for maybe comparing fractions and understanding which one has a greater or less value. So I could give kids a whole worksheet of these problems and just, the way they typically look is you have a fraction on the left, a fraction on the right, and then you have to put like either a greater than or less than or equal to sign in the middle. And I could totally give that to kids and they could complete it. But yet every teacher knows that you've had that kid who totally rocked the worksheet and then later you find out has no idea what they're talking about. And why is that happening? Like, how did you not know? If they're completely answering a worksheet, shouldn't that mean that they understand it? But what I found is that kids can often get the correct answer and also have a lot of misconceptions about what they know. So the reality with a problem like this is that virtually no one gets it right on their first try or their second try or their third try. Like, every single, so say you pick 1, 2 over 3, 4, you got 12 over 34. Where do you go from there? Do you go, I don't know, 34 over 56? And where do you go from there? You could find that you might wind up having 10 or 20 fractions that you're constantly checking to see how close is it to 1. And then the question that I ask people is, how do you know you can't get any closer? And you get fights that break out in the room because someone thinks they've got the closest fraction, and now someone else has another closer fraction, but their fraction can't be closer than yours, so how do you prove? And so you have these fights that just never end. And it just leads to really great conversations in the classroom. So the idea that practice is not happening is better defined as practice maybe is not happening in the way that it used to happen, but it's certainly happening.
Yeah. And yeah, so as I'm thinking about these problems, and I'm popping around on some of the problems on the website here, openmiddle.com, I think about it, the value of this being that you're connecting the math thinking in a multiple of ways. And to me, that's one of the things. We do lots of work in project-based learning, and as we analyze and we evaluate and think through the content, in this case the math content, that we're connecting it in a number of different ways, again, not in a vacuum, not just on a skill, on a worksheet, repetition and practice. And so the sustainability, the durability of the understanding it seems would be greater. And is that what you found?
Yeah, kids, in addition to being so traditionally when we have kids work on problems over and over like a worksheet, we're trying to build their procedural skills so that they can use the algorithm or the formula quickly and efficiently. And you still get that with these open middle problems, but you also help students build conceptual understanding, which is one thing with that problem I gave you is that kids start to realize, okay, I want to be closer to 1. I want my numerator and my denominator to be as close together as possible, right, in their value. Or they start to realize that when the denominator is a bigger value, a greater value, the pieces are smaller. So even if they're a different amount apart, you have them closer together. And so you have a lot of this building of both procedural skill and conceptual understanding. And something that I think is really interesting, if teachers want to check this out, is if you're on Twitter, check out the hashtag #WhyOpenMiddle. So WHY Open Middle. And the really astounding thing is that countless teachers talk about how much their kids love these problems, how much they persevered more than they expected them to, how much conceptual understanding that was built, how they didn't want to go to recess because they wanted to work on these problems, how they were doing them with their parents because they were so proud of what they had done. And it's a really wonderful thing that I think was missing from a lot of our educations when we were students.
Mm-hmm. So what is your, I guess, take or thinking about real world math and real world problems and project-based learning? Do you have much experience or thinking about that?
Yeah, so on my website, robertkaplinsky.com, that's KAPLINSKY.com, under lessons, I've got about 70 real world lessons that range from which Bed Bath & Beyond coupon should you use at $5 off or 20% off, to how much did it cost to buy a 100 by 100 burger at In-N-Out, which was a cheeseburger with 100 layers of meat and cheese, to really just a span of these problems. And I think that students love them. I mean, who doesn't, right? They're a lot of fun doing them with students. And I think that they're a great complement. Personally, I believe that math should be much more focused on problem solving and less on computation. Because again, in real life right now, when you leave school, you're not going to be doing the calculations that you were doing in school because you have a calculator, but problem solving will still be there. Knowing what to put into the calculator will still be there. So I'm a huge fan of problem-based learning. I'm less familiar with project-based learning because that's a much bigger chunk and much harder to implement than a problem-based lesson, which is a much small, like a bite-sized chunk. But I think that both of those are fantastic. And so the authors of the Common Core State Standards defined rigor, like having a rigorous understanding of math, as having 3 components. So whether you're for or against Common Core, you should kind of agree with these ideas. Like, kids should have procedural skill, they should have conceptual understanding, and they should have the ability to apply the math that they've learned. And so I think open middle really helps with the first 2, right? Procedural skills and conceptual understanding. And I think these real world problems really help kids get practice at applying the mathematics. So I think all 3 are very important.
Yeah, I talked with Dan Meyer about a number of things on a podcast episode before, but when we talked about project-based learning, he was not convinced that was, I guess maybe, I'm trying to think back and it's been a while and I don't want to mischaracterize his words, but that it is so difficult to really pull that off at a high quality that it's maybe not worth the amount of time to put in to design a project versus problem. And I would agree. And math teachers in particular have struggled, in our experience, working on project-based learning and trying to find an authentic audience and making it less simulation, more actual real-world problem. I think part of that is because the way that we have traditionally taught and thought about math, but also because so many math teachers are trained to be math teachers and don't have a whole lot of experience necessarily in the quote-unquote real world. And so they do have sometimes, I think, a hard time envisioning and seeing where that math lands in the real world and real problems to be working on. And there's other reasons why it becomes difficult. There's the amount of material and things that you're supposed to teach and learn and cover, and other pieces that are friction points. But I like the idea of problem-based learning in lots of cases because it incorporates lots of the inquiry that we're trying to build. And when I say project-based learning is a great way, and we should be doing tons of that, I think that, to your point, problem solving, we need to, our kids turning into adults need to be developing the skill of being problem solvers, which means asking the questions. And traditional math doesn't tend to, at least in my experience, foster that skill.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. Let's see. First, maybe it's worth distinguishing, in my opinion at least, the difference between project-based learning and problem-based learning. So problem-based learning tends to be like a small bite-sized question, like which Bed Bath & Beyond coupon should you use. Project-based learning might be how do we build a house, and what kind of math do we need? And so you might have parts that do with ordering supplies and figuring out sales tax, and then figuring out the angles to cut things at, and figuring out solar panels. And it could just be a super complex really some sort of mathematical context that would last and span weeks or months or longer. And what I have found is not necessarily that the limiting, I think that maybe if teachers have not had experience outside of education, maybe that's something, but we live our lives every day. So I don't really think that's a big deal. I think the bigger deal is that it's hard to find any context that perfectly aligns with any specific grade level standards. Right, you'll find stuff that's either from a different grade level or from previous grade levels, and it's really just hard to find a topic for any single and so I haven't done a lot of that just because I don't know of it's much easier to find a bite-sized problem than it is to figure out a larger project. I mean, especially considering that different states have different standards at different grade levels. So I think there was another point that I have lost, but that's the basic idea in terms of that. Yeah, no,
I think you're right. I mean, that's one of the friction points is that there's a sort of linear aspect of the sets of standards, and to some extent that at least makes sense with math and building foundations. I don't know if it's exactly linear, but there is some linear aspect to it, right? Of building, you're not doing high-level algebra without being able to add, subtract, divide, multiply, those kinds of things. So that is one of the friction points that we find, in addition to the fact that there tends to be an overwhelming amount of skills and content that are supposed to be taught in any given class, that it feels like the usual or a typical reply is, I just don't know that I have time to do this. And maybe that's partially because we're trying to teach too much. I don't know.
Oh, there's so many issues. I surveyed teachers and I asked them, do you have enough time to teach 1 year of standards in 1 year? And 85% of them said no. The ones that said yes, a lot of them had like greater 80 to 90 to 2 hour a day math class chunks. So I think there's that. I think also there's this issue from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. The 7th habit is sharpening the saw. Mm-hmm. And the basic story, just for people who have not heard the story, is that a man is walking through a forest and he sees a lumberjack trying to cut down a tree, but he's swearing profusely and frustrated. The man asks, "What's going on? Are you okay?" And the man says, "I'm trying to cut down this tree, but my saw blade is too dull." And the man's like, "Well, why don't you stop to sharpen it?" And the lumberjack says, "Well, because I have to cut down the tree." And this kind of competing interest of you kind of want to do one, but you have to do the other two, plays out in education, right? You've got teachers who need to take days off because you need to learn more things. But then if you take too many days off, you fall so far behind and you're so criticized that it's really challenging. And so I think that's another issue that we find, is just that we're expected to teach in ways that we haven't been taught. And it seems that a lot of the traditional professional development options don't meet our needs well. So that's something I'm also interested with my company, Grassroots Workshops.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more, or tell me a little bit more about the Observe Me movement. You started a hashtag movement, campaign, whatever you want to call it, called Observe Me. Yeah.
So how the hell did we get to a place in education where we don't want anyone in our room, and the idea of anyone coming to observe you by your own free will is remarkable? Like, think about that. How did we get to that place, right? The idea that someone came in to watch you teach should be the most unremarkable thing, yet we all know it's just not the case. And that's really kind of where the genesis of Observe Me came from. A friend named Heather Cohn shared a tweet of a picture she took where there was a sign saying something to the effect of, "Come in and observe my classroom, and here's what I'd like feedback on." And I think some remarkable things are worth pointing out. First, that someone actively was soliciting people coming into their classroom, where we all know that the reality is that people try their best to not get people to come in and observe them. I think that, and I guess part of that is that a lot of times observations are something that's done to you. It's one-sided, where an administrator is evaluating your worth. And so that's just a part that's hard to get past. I think the other thing that's remarkable is that the teacher specifically asked for information in specific areas. And that's not something that often happens. Again, it's usually one-sided, and they're coming in to tell you things, not you telling them what you would like to get better at. And so that's really kind of, something resonated about that with me. And I decided to make a blog post, I think it was, in October of 2016, or maybe it was 17 now, I can't remember, where I made this hashtag Observe Me, and I encouraged teachers to make signs where they would put the word Observe Me, one word, with a hashtag, and then list 3 things they want feedback on. And so what would happen would be that the person observing would look at that list, come on inside, and give feedback. What's important to realize is that this is not a one-sided way where maybe the person doing the teaching is so amazing and the observer has to learn from them because they're so great. It's also not the other way around, where the person teaching is so awful that the person doing the observation has to give them feedback. It's really acknowledging the reality that the smartest people in the room are us, and that we have so much we can learn from each other. So if we were just to come into each other's classroom and see what they're doing, each person would find something mutually beneficial out of the relationship. So I shared that, and then just to my great surprise, it took off. Soon it was like in multiple countries, on multiple continents. It quickly left math education. It was really in every subject, from Spanish to history to English to even the business world. People started using it. Administrators started using it. And I really, I guess my hope is that it will remove some of the barriers of collaborating, which is, I think, the single best thing we could all do is learn from each other.
Yeah, that's one of our more popular blog posts that we have on TeachThought and TeachThought PD. The two sites is titled "Why Teachers Need Formative Assessment Too," which has a very similar feel to it, right? And there's a sign. The author is Paul Moss, and I'm Paul Moss, and I teach English. I'm looking for feedback on. He's got 3 things: ensuring students know how to progress in an activity, checking progress in an activity, using questions to assess progress, and so the idea of peer feedback and peer critique and that openness, that culture shift, I do think is an absolute game changer. And we work on that in our workshops, right? So that we shift away from that evaluative observation, administration, and flatten that hierarchy in ways that there is no real threat of somebody coming in your room. As a matter of fact, it's viewed as an opportunity. And there's lots of things that have to happen with that, right? So one of the things that we offer is lesson study, and that is sort of an extension of that. So we're observing each other, we're then reflecting on that process outside of that observation, which to me is an important piece, because one thing that I have heard and I pushed back on is just doing like that observation without any structure. And somebody said on Twitter once, they said, nobody ever stole a bad idea from watching somebody else. And I thought, well, that's certainly not true. Certainly, hopefully when we go and we see somebody doing something and we really liked it, and we're going to do it, then that's a good thing, but that's not necessarily true. So we have to have some structures in place to a lens for quality, right? A rubric of sorts, something that we're, as you said, sort of here's what I'm working on, and here's what I'm looking to improve on. And can you give me evidence? Can you provide some feedback that might be evidence of me doing that well or not doing that well?
I think there's definitely value at some point to determining how we know something's effective or what measures of effectiveness we're actually listening or looking for. I think, though, that with Observe Me, it's a little bit different. Like, I'll give you another way of kind of thinking about it. I was a secondary math teacher, and just being honest, like, I tried my best first period, but like I made so many mistakes that by 5th period, I was like, okay, I finally know how to teach this lesson well. And 5th period went so much more smoothly. And why? It's because during the lesson, I was looking for different information using my eyes and my ears and just trying to absorb feedback that would help me make adjustments, that, formative information that would help me make adjustments to refine my lesson and make it better. Now, the reality is I'm just one person, and I'm at the front of the class or wherever I am roaming the room. And if there were more eyes and more ears in the classroom, I could collect even better data and make even better decisions. And so that's kind of where I see Observe Me, is that you're asking people to be your eyes and ears and give you information about stuff you're curious about. And then from there, maybe you can determine whether it's even the right, right strategy to be using. But that's a little bit beyond where I'm at least in terms of how I initially conceived Observe Me. It's really just getting people in each other's classrooms, having these conversations, and getting better feedback to the person who wants the feedback.
Yeah, no, that makes real sense, and I think both can happen and should happen, and both are great ways to think about how do we change that culture from closing the door and just doing what you think you're doing, and whether that's quality or not, to more collaborative conversations and dialogue. And again, I think that peer critique is a is a widely overlooked and underused way to improve the quality of teaching and learning in our schools and classrooms, because it really gets teachers to hold each other accountable. And I don't, the way that I use that language is not meant to be, again, in an evaluative way, but that this is what we do and this is how we do things, and that we're all sort of pulling in the same direction, and we're trying to improve our craft, and that happens best when we talk about that craft and what we're struggling with, and what was done well, and how that fits with our mission and vision, and all of those pieces. So I'm mindful of time here, and I do want to give you an opportunity. I know you have a book and you have some workshops, so I want to give you an opportunity to share any of those things, as well as social media links or anything else you want to share.
Yeah, thank you so much, Drew. So I would say that if you're curious about open middle problems, you can go to openmiddle.com. Everything is free there. There's actually in the very center of the page there, we have our favorite problem from every grade level, from kindergarten through calculus. So if you're curious about what a problem might look like for your class, I would start there. We explain kind of the hints, the answer, and why we love the problem. I wrote a book about open middle and how to use it in your class. It's called Open Middle Math: Problems that Unlock Student Thinking. You can actually find a link to it on the Open Middle website in the top right corner. My website, if you're interested in some real world problems, it's robertkaplinsky.com, Kaplinsky. I've got them under lessons. And if you're looking for support in doing this, I have an online workshop that I offer in the fall and in the spring. And you can find more about that at robertkaplinsky.com/EPS, like empowered problem solving. So thank you, Drew.
Yeah. Any social media links or anything you want to share?
Yeah. So I'm pretty much everywhere at Robert Kaplinsky, except for Instagram. It's Robert_Kaplinsky. And so, yeah, Twitter, Facebook, Pinterest, Instagram. I'd love to connect with you there.
Okay, great. Well, Robert, it was a pleasure talking with you. Certainly, math education is something we need to do a better job of teaching and learning. So I appreciate the conversation and the work that you're doing.
Thank you, sir.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.